It's a real privilege for JRoots to be able to work so closely with Seed on the journey to Poland, and also understanding that even when we can't travel, we can think of ways in order to bring the messages from there to the Seed community and beyond. Today, being Tisha B'Av, is the day that we engage in the Jewish tragedy right from the very beginnings of history. And if anything has come to symbolize Jewish tragedy, it's the day of Tisha B'Av. It is the ultimate symbol, so much so that we're still, thousands of years later, sitting on the floor, reciting the kinot, the lamentations, reading the book of Eicha, all in order to sort of connect back to that first tragedy, really the destruction of the two temples. But every tragedy that has come subsequently has been, in a sense, subsumed into the family of Tisha B'Av, of this day of Jewish tragedy. And the Shoah, the Holocaust, has been no different. And Tisha B'Av also has specific significance in terms of the story of the Shoah that we're telling, really in a story that comes before Auschwitz, because on the previous Shabbat that we just held, on Shabbat, it was known as Shabbat Chazon, the Shabbat of Vision, named after the Haftarah, the reading from the book of Isaiah about the Chazon, the vision that he receives, the prophecy. And there was a man living inside the Warsaw Ghetto, the Rebbe of Piasetzna, and all the way through the time period of the ghetto, he taught his students. He carried on preaching and teaching. And although he did not survive, and the vast majority of his students did not survive, his writings survived, buried underground of the Warsaw Ghetto. And these sermons that he gave were published. And that last sermon that he gave before Tisha B'Av of 1942 spoke about why is it that the Shabbat before Tisha B'Av is known as a Shabbat of Vision. It's because a vision given to a prophet is the harshest of things. It's the most difficult type of prophecy to receive, because no one can deal with actually seeing the tragedy, because he says that seeing the tragedy is so incomparable to just hearing about it, to reading about it. Seeing with your own eyes is something really tragic. And the reason that sermon that he gave became so significant was because a couple of days later, on Tisha B'Av of 1942, the deportation of Warsaw Jewry began. And that really was, in a sense, the last message that he gave there in the ghetto. And as we approach and we sit inside Tisha B'Av and we deal with various aspects of Jewish tragedy, I think we all understand that we can't compare seeing to hearing. We, thank God, live in a time, even though times of great crisis, in a time where even the events of 75 years ago are almost impossible for us to imagine. And what we do by coming here to Auschwitz Birkenau today is to try and connect in a sense to the place, to try and bring this more modern tragedy into the family of that which we are doing on Tisha B'Av. And if Tisha B'Av is the symbol of Jewish tragedy, then the place that we're standing in front of the gates of Birkenau have become the symbol of the Holocaust. And you want to know what it is that builds a symbol like this? Why Auschwitz more than anywhere else? Because although the numbers that we're dealing with are vast, you are talking about a place which claims the lives of in excess of 1 million Jews. Close to 1.3 million people are deported there. The vast majority of them who are murdered there are Jews, but it's also a place of extermination of Poles and other minorities for whom the Nazis had no space. But the vastness of the numbers, you know what? There are places, Treblinka, which talks in numbers of close to 900,000. There are also places of vastness. So it's not just the numbers. One element of the reason that Auschwitz becomes a symbol is because it existed at the end and there were survivors. There are people to tell their story. The fact that myself and Rabbi Edwards are lucky enough to be able to walk into this gate together with Leslie Kleinman, to be able to tell from his own mouth to our own ears the stories of what happened to him, is going to be unlike the vast majority of the camps, the extermination camps that existed, because people are going to eventually be liberated. Some of them, the lucky ones, are going to be liberated from Auschwitz, and those are the people who begin to tell us their story. But as we look at the gates here, I really want to say that the story doesn't start here. And I'm going to ask Lukasz, who's together with our camera, to turn around, because you're looking at the train tracks now that head inside the gate of Birkenau. But I think it's only appropriate to start the story of Auschwitz Birkenau by looking out along those train tracks and asking the question not of what happened inside the camp, not of how people died, but where people came from and how people lived. Because if you talk about one of the unique things about Auschwitz, it was the fact that it was a unification, it was a bringing together of Jews from all over Europe. And the map of deportation points towards Auschwitz stretches as far as France in the west, as far as Russia in the east, and south to Saloniki, to where the Jews of Sephardic origin came from, up to Oslo in the north. And you realize that Auschwitz takes on this central role. And the thing that unites those people is that they all came from outside. They had lives which existed before Auschwitz came into their life. None of those people was born as a Holocaust survivor or a Holocaust victim or even someone waiting for tragedy. They were born as Jews living their lives, doing what they were doing. And as you think about before we step into Auschwitz, if you think about the people who ended up in Auschwitz, you ask yourself a question. When was the last time in Jewish history that a Jew from Paris, a Jew from Vitebsk, a Jew from Oslo, and a Jew from Saloniki, on the four corners of Europe, so to speak, when was the last time that these people were together? And I think you would probably have to go back around 2,000 years in Jewish history, possibly even to today, to the 9th of Av, in the year 70, when the destruction happened and the great exile began, that the Jews were separated out into four corners of the earth. It took close to 2,000 years for those Jews to be brought back together. But as the camera pans back round towards the camp, you see that unfortunately it was a place like this that was to bring us together. But the reason that I look out before we step inside, and as Lukács is going to walk towards the camp, the reason that we look outwards is because the interesting thing about people is not how they died, it is how they lived. And any of you who have ever visited a Shiva house will know that the thing we do at a Shiva house is not sit with a mourner and discuss the end. We don't discuss the moment that someone left this world. We don't discuss the disease. That's not interesting. What's interesting is the way that they lived, the jokes that they told and who they were. And as we stand here just for a moment, before we enter into this gate, we have it upon ourselves to bear in mind those stories of those individuals, because once we go inside, you're looking at the vastness of Birkenau, of Auschwitz, which doesn't have space, so to speak, for those individuals. And we're about to walk inside a gate, and a gate in Hebrew is known as a sha'ar. And today, the greeting or the blessing that we give to someone who is a mourner, to someone who's experienced a loss, in Hebrew is Makom Yenachem Etchem. B'toch sha'ar Avelei Tzion v'Yerushalayim. We say, may God comfort you amongst the mourners of Zion and Jerusalem. And the word sha'ar, for those of you who are listening with an attentive ear, the word sha'ar there, if we're going to pan around the camera to look towards the gate looking outwards, the word sha'ar there means amongst. That may God comfort you amongst those who are mourning also for Zion and also for Jerusalem. But in Hebrew letters are interchangeable sometimes, and an aleph and an ayin mean that you can read the verse differently. May God comfort you b'sha'ar Avelei Tzion v'Yerushalayim, at the gate of those who mourn Zion and Jerusalem. And as we enter in this gate here, we are all mourners, and it does not matter whether you are Sephardi or Ashkenazi, whether you are a family which is touched by the tragedy that this place encompasses, because Tisha B'Av teaches you that it can be 2,000 years later and you can still feel the pain and the sadness of the destruction. And the destruction that takes place here is a destruction that is part of a continuation, a continuum that began close to 2,000 years ago. And we're going to pan the camera around for a moment. And as we look to the left, and we're going to pan around the camp, you see the vastness of Auschwitz Birkenau, because Auschwitz Birkenau does dominate the world of the concentration camps and the death camps in terms of its size. You're talking about a space of in excess of 420 acres. And when Auschwitz Birkenau, which is one of the extensions of the Auschwitz camp, when Auschwitz Birkenau was established in 1942, it is going to essentially become the jewel in the crown of the Nazi operation. And everything that you can see, pretty much as far as the camera can see over here, we're going to move around looking up the train tracks. Those birch trees that you can see on the horizon are the edge of the camp in that direction, the birch trees from which Birkenau gets its name. And as we pan over here, absolutely everything that you can see, the barracks in the foreground, all the way into the forest in the far right-hand corner, you're talking about a place that would take at least half an hour, 45 minutes, so to speak, to be able to reach on the far side of the camp, a camp which was imagined ultimately to be able to contain 200,000 prisoners. It was going to be the center of the slave labor force of the Nazis that they were going to harness in their effort to win a war which was a war of territory and also a war of ideology. And in terms of the ideological war, the main focus, the main target was the Jewish people. And Auschwitz-Birkenau is going to fulfill those two functions, both using the slave labor and ultimately being a place, or the place, the most well-known place, the place with the highest numbers of the extermination of the Jews. And as we said, Jews could have come from anywhere. Sephardi, Ashkenazi, religious, not religious. There are people who are going to arrive here who their first encounter with their Jewish identity is going to be when they are rounded up and brought here. But it doesn't matter when it comes to Auschwitz, because this is going to be the place of concentration of the Jews. And the thing that will unite them is going to be this journey on the train tracks, which Lukas is going to start walking along now. And the train tracks here, the train journey, which we've heard each of us countless testimonies of the conditions inside those cattle cars, one of which we'll see in a few moments. Conditions with in excess of 100 people in a closed space with a bucket for water and a bucket for waste. And journeys which should have taken, in terms of distance, maybe a couple of hours or a few hours could take days. And the experience, for instance, of the Sephardi Jews from Greece, some of those journeys took 10 or 12 days, which meant that by the time the trains are arriving here in Auschwitz, it is not a question of dealing with people. It is a question of disposing of bodies when they open the train. But inside those trains, those stories that we hear, there's a man called by the name of Yisrael Aviram. And Yisrael Aviram was a young boy traveling from Lodz, being deported to Auschwitz. And he's inside the train carriage and after an existence inside the Lodz ghetto, and he sees on the other side of the train carriage, he sees a young girl, a girl that he knows, one of his participants from his youth movement, and he sees that she's sitting in the corner of the train carriage crying. And he manages to move through the train carriage, through the hustle and bustle of people, and he gets to her and he says to her, "Why are you crying?" And she doesn't answer him. He asks again, "Why is it that you're crying?" And just silence, nothing, until the girl sitting next to her, who is her sister, whispers to him and says, she's crying because she needs to go to the bathroom. And she's embarrassed in front of all of these people. And Yisrael Aviram hears this inside the train carriage. And if you pause for a moment, you should think that Yisrael Aviram should say to her, seriously, perspective, look where you've been. Look where you're going. Even if you don't know exactly where it is, it's not a good place. You can't be worrying about these things anymore. You have to get some perspective. The worst thing in the world is not that you need to go to the bathroom and that you're embarrassed, but instead, Yisrael Aviram turns to some of his friends. He pulls them over, and with a piece of material, they make a small section of the corner of the train carriage, in order for the girl to go to the bathroom in some semblance of privacy. And why do I tell you this? Because Yisrael Aviram shows that it is not about encountering people where you think they should be. He meets this girl where she is. And if at that moment in time, the greatest tragedy that is befalling her is the fact that she's embarrassed, he says, if that's your problem, then it's my problem as well. And if it's my problem and your problem, I'm going to find a way to fix it. What you see is that despite conditions, people are able and willing, and people did, in the same place where humanity falls as low as it could go, there are other people who pick up their sensitivity to humanity. And you ask a further question of Yisrael Aviram, which is, why would he have noticed in the first place? Because as a teenage boy, having lost everyone and being in the same fate as everyone in that train carriage, he could quite well have turned around and say, I've got to worry about myself. But what does he do? He tunes into the tears of someone else. He hears the pain of someone else from a distance, and he says, that's part of my problem. And as we look around the camp, you realize that the one thing that often remained here was choices. People, even though their realm and the space that they had to make decisions got smaller, there were still choices to be made. And someone like Yisrael Aviram proves that someone had the opportunity and the ability to choose to be a human being. And if that is simply dealing with the embarrassment of a young girl and being able to solve it, that's a place of humanity, or that is humanity, in a place where humanity is literally being destroyed. And as we approach the ramp, those trains rolling in from all over Europe with Yisrael Aviram and countless others, there's one thing that strikes me about being able to guide in Auschwitz today, together with Lukasz on the camera, which is that normally when we're standing in Auschwitz, we get to see 360 degrees. We see Auschwitz from all directions and with 75 years of hindsight. But there's something about having the 180 degrees in front of us, only where the screen turns, that reminds you that when people arrived here, they had no concept, many of them, of where it was they were going, what it was they were looking at. Because from the sealed train carriage, which you see approaching in the foreground, from inside of that, maybe a crack through the wood, maybe a window, a small window covered in barbed wire if it hadn't been boarded up. And maybe one person becomes the emissary of everybody else being looking out of that window or out of that crack in the train carriage, saying where they are. Which direction are we traveling? What language are the signs of the stations in? What type of place are we arriving into? And as the train pulls into the ramp over here, what are the impressions of the place? And if you want to understand the naivety that could exist, there was a young girl called Rachel Baum who, in a plan that she'd made with a friend of hers in the Lodz ghetto, she boarded one of these trains in summer of 1944 in order to relate what it was that was happening, where these trains were going to, because the Jews in the Lodz ghetto had no sense. And if I can just share the picture that's on the screen, what you see here from the shared screen is a note that she left inside the train carriage, hidden between those pieces of wood, which catalogued her journey. This note, eventually, when the train returned empty to Lodz, was found by her friend, Mendek, and he read it, and it catalogued the stations that they stopped at, and eventually it says 12 o'clock noon to 12:30, Birkenau. There were men, there were women, there were children. Things seem okay, writes Rachel Baum. We can come back to the video. What you get a sense here is that someone could board a train, and Rachel Baum had already understood that there were places called death camps, but she arrives in Birkenau with absolutely no sense. And as we look around here, you only get to see what you get to see. The limited understanding of so many of those people who arrive thinking that maybe this is just a transit camp. Maybe it is a place that they're going to truly send us to work. What they have no idea is the concept of the type of place they are in. And if we want to be able to see what this place is like, we can look around now, but we're not there. We're in the former site of the camp. We don't really understand, but one thing we can use in order to try and see inside the camp are some of the pictures which have become so well known. And it was all thanks to a young woman called Lily Jacobs, because Lily Jacobs was deported to Auschwitz in the summer of 1944, together with her family. And she manages to survive. But upon liberation, far from Auschwitz, she'd been on the death marches, she ends up in a place called Dora. She's in a building which had belonged to some of the guards, and she wakes up and she goes foraging for food. And she looks inside cupboards, and she doesn't find any food, but she does find a book, and she finds a photo album. And if I can share the screen over here for a second, she opens this photo album, and one of the first photos that she sees is what you can see on the screen coming up just now. It is the photo of three religious-looking gentlemen, but for her it's significant because for Lily Jacobs, this is the picture of her rabbi, Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Weiss from Bilka, and she recognizes him, and she starts turning the pages, and she turns page after page after page. Eventually, she comes to this photograph, and here she freezes, because if Lukács sort of turns the camera around slightly to see the angle from where this photograph was taken, you can see that these two boys with the train behind them are not just any two boys, they're her 9 and 11-year-old brothers. She sees her brothers standing exactly where you're standing now on the ramp in Birkenau. And she looks page after page after page. She turns a page to what you can see now in front of you on both screens, which is her grandparents sitting on the step of the train carriage, awaiting what is to come next. And eventually, she turns to this page where she sees a photo of herself standing in the front row. Lily Jacobs has found pretty much the only photographic evidence of that which took place inside Birkenau, save for a few other illegally taken photographs. And this album that becomes known as the Auschwitz Album catalogues from start to almost finish what it was that happened over a couple of day period in the summer of 1944 when the Hungarian Jews were arriving. And over the years, she eventually dedicates and donates her pictures, this album, to Yad Vashem, who publish it. And when Yad Vashem published the photographs, everybody looks at them. Everybody looks at these photographs to try and identify their family members, to see who it was, to see if it was them, because photographs become one of the most valuable assets that a Holocaust survivor can hold on to. Because maybe if you have a photograph, you can remember who was in your family. Maybe you can remember what they looked like. Maybe you can remember their facial features. Maybe you'll know in future years when you have children or grandchildren, you'll be able to say that they have a familial resemblance. And the photographs are published and people write in and identify themselves. A number of people I know have found either themselves or relatives in the album. But when Yad Vashem published this photograph that we're looking at now, the caption says, "Women and children wait upon the ramp," exactly where you're standing, non-identified. That means that everybody looked at this photograph and no one managed to identify anyone in the picture. And what we know of Auschwitz Birkenau is that people of this profile, women, children, the elderly, they were amongst the 80 to 90% of every train transport that arrives, which went straight to the gas chambers. You don't have to be a scholar to understand that these people did not survive Auschwitz Birkenau. But if you ask yourself a question, which is how many people in the world could match your face to your name? How many people know who you are? Obviously your family, your friends, anyone you've been in an institution with, your community, people you've worked with. And the numbers reach vast numbers. Hundreds and thousands of people will be able to match your name to your face. When you look at this photograph, you understand the vastness of the place that you're standing, because Auschwitz Birkenau doesn't just mean that a photograph of women, children, and the elderly of about 16 or 17 people, that they were murdered. It means that every single human being on the face of the earth who could even say one of those people's names and match their face to their name is also dead. If you want to understand why on Tisha B'Av we stand in a place like this, it's because a photograph like this shows you the vastness of the tragedy that you're standing within. And this point that you're standing upon, really known as the point of the selection. You can see the gate that we entered into in the far distance, And if you just get a sense of how big the place is, that you're in the middle of the length of the camp, and a train that's arriving would stretch from one of these carriages all the way almost towards the gate, and the same distance again towards the back of the camp, which Lukács is going to pan over to now, where the two buildings that are missing today, which is the Crematoria. The gas chambers and Crematoria, one of the things that the Germans did destroy before leaving the camp in their process of denial of the Holocaust, something that the SEED program is going to come back to later on this afternoon. If we bring up the screen just once again, so some of those photographs that Lily Jacobs bequeathed to us, you can see, if we put it side by side with the video, you can see the building on the left-hand side of the photograph. If the camera just pans around slightly and stops there, is the building on that you're looking at now, and stretching out to the side, there's a chimney rising on the right-hand side of the photograph, an area which is not there that belongs to the Crematorium gas chamber number 2, which we will end at shortly. But what you're seeing in the photograph here is the getting down from the train, the waiting for that moment of the selection, the absolute chaos of the separation between men and women and children. And very soon, the German efficiency means that you have these two lines. Exactly where we're standing, those soldiers are standing with their job, their task is going to be to decide with a flick of a finger who's going to live and who's going to die. As we're familiar with from the liturgy of Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, mi yichyeh u'mi yamut, a place on earth where someone is literally going to decide the fate of those who stand before them, who is going to live and who is going to die. And if the camera can just sort of turn around slightly towards the point of the selection, I want to turn back to Leslie, who we mentioned before, the cute little boy sitting here on the front, who was about 14 years old when he came to Auschwitz. And Leslie will tell you that that point, the camera just pans around to the right a little bit, that point of the selection is one of his hardest places to see. We can come back just to the video footage. Because that is the place where life and death intersect. It is a place where, on the one hand, he lost everything and everybody. All of the people in the photograph, everyone he loses, and all of a sudden, with a flick of a finger, Leslie's an orphan with no family to speak of, alone in the world. But on the other hand, it is the physical space, it is the place where his life is saved, because the heroic man that Rabbi Edwards described this morning, just before, who goes from school to school and backwards and forwards from England to Poland in order to tell his story, in order to speak out against hatred, that man's life, in a sense, was saved there. And it's that crisis between the two which makes it one of the hardest places, and coming back time after time together with Leslie is one of the hardest places to be, where he tells his story and his story of loss. Now, as we said, the vast majority of people who got off the train like that would have headed straight up where the people are standing on the left-hand side and walked straight up towards the factories that loomed over Auschwitz Birkenau, that every person who arrived asked the question, what type of industry is it here? No one could have believed that the answer would be it's the industry of death that these factories were producing, so to speak. Those people who were brought into the camp, don't make the mistake that the antithesis of death by gas in Auschwitz is life. It's just death by a different route. That the Germans, the Nazis, understood that they could make some use of the slave labor for a while, but these people would be totally dispensable. They could be gotten rid of, they could be worked to death within a matter of months. And if we pull up the screen just one more time, and if Lukács just takes a step back, you'll be able to see these women walking into the camp, and the building that you see on the left-hand side is the building that's the roof that's sticking down on the left-hand side of the video. You can see the trains behind. I'm going to ask Lukács to start walking in towards the camp itself, so to speak, as we leave the reception area. We can pull off the share screen, and as we head into this gate, we start to follow in the footsteps for a moment of those who entered into the camp. And entry into the camp involved a number of things, and the building that's coming up on our right was one of the buildings used as an element of the reception, which is the sauna. Lukáš can keep walking and we'll be able to see it as he walks past. We've got sort of some distance to travel now. And it is this place that so many of those elements that stick into our mind from the Holocaust testimonies of survivors, of undressing, of showers, and really one of the things that sets Auschwitz aside is going to be the giving of the numbers. With the camera, we can walk all the way we can keep walking past the building, Lukáš. We're going to be heading in towards the women's camp. And those of you who have read Primo Levi describes what it was after the undressing and after the showers and after the haircut, to have the thing which he cherished, his name replaced with a number, and a tattoo that sat upon his arm until his death. And this is one of the things that we associate so closely with the experience of the survivor or the prisoner in Auschwitz, which is having that thing which someone in the world, a parent, turned around on the 8th day, whenever it may have been, a certain point at the beginning of a baby's life, and said, "This child shall bear this name. It shall be called by this name." And it's the thing that humanizes us. It's the thing that personalizes who we are. It's the thing by which we are known to everybody. I spoke before about matching a face to a name. The two things that people recognize us by are our face and our name. And that building over there replaces names with numbers. But if we talk about choices, and I come back to Leslie for a moment, you realize that people make their own choices, even when there are none. Because Leslie has decided that the number upon his arm, which is 8230, Leslie Kleiman will not allow that number to define him as simply a vessel or a tool that belonged to the Nazi war machine. He adds up the numbers of 8 and 2 and 3 to the total of 13, and he says that the way he grew up adding up numbers to correspond to Hebrew letters, he finds the word ahava. Aleph, hey, bet, hey. He finds the word love. And it is an incredible moment to hear Leslie Kleiman, who all of the suffering that you see surrounding you, he experienced it. But he turns around and says that his abiding takeaway is love. Because the only way to rectify the destruction that you're looking at is through love. And he finds that even in the act that was done to him in order to dehumanize him, to take that away. But what does he do? He chooses to react to the world differently. For those prisoners who you saw who entered into the camp, you're now seeing on your left some of the brick barracks that were built at the beginning of the building of Birkenau. And bear in mind that this entire complex was built by slave laborers, by prisoners themselves. And on the right, as Lukáš keeps walking forwards, you're going to see the remains, the bases, the foundations of some of the wooden barracks, which were part of the women's camp. The wooden barracks, the wood is no longer there. Much of it was taken away after the war. But what you can see here are the hearth, the chimneys, which existed there as part of a heating system, not necessarily always used, almost rarely used, but stretching would have been barrack after barrack after barrack, giving the sense of an entire city, so to speak. The distance and the vastness of Auschwitz. And the area that we're in now as we walk up was known as the women's camp. And as we walk through, I think it is important to consider the plight of the women, the Jewish women in particular in Auschwitz, because the world that we live in today, and that our mothers, our wives, our daughters, my mother, wife, daughter, and the women that among us, the privileges and the access to education is far beyond what it was 75 years ago, 80 years ago, that maybe our grandparents experienced. But that also means that many of the women who did enter here, for them, the experience was even harsher. And there are testimonies and there is talk even amongst the camp guards themselves about how brutal the conditions were for the women inside the camp. But again, that didn't stop individual women making choices and making decisions to hold on to who they were and to hold on to their humanity. And there's a woman called Pearl Banish, who was here in the area of the women's camp. Originally, her story begins in Krakow. And Pearl Banish describes the moment that we described before of the haircutting. And she says that the woman who cut her hair did it with such tenderness. She says, the girl who attended to me was by no means an expert hairdresser, but it appears she wanted me to look dignified. She goes back and she says that how mercilessly her hair would have been cut, but nevertheless, she turns and says, may God reward you. And those small acts of kindness, because she had a choice to cut the hair brutally of another girl or to cut the hair with some care and attention, and she chooses to give care and attention in a place where it's not valued. But Pearl Banish is the receiving end of that, and she sees inside this place which lacks so much humanity, people make choices in order to hold on to their humanity. And as we start to walk through the women's camp, we're going to head up really in a very quick sense as we move towards the other element of the camp, because the slave labor and the prisoners who live here is going to be one element. But the gap, the space up above us, up ahead of us, of the building which is no longer there, is going to be the thing that, in a sense, sets Auschwitz aside. It's going to be the remains that we're about to approach of the building which is going to place Auschwitz at the apex of the industry of death and extermination, which humanity had really never known before. And as you approach this place, you approach a place which changed the Jewish lexicon and the lexicon of humanity, because up until this point, pretty much in history, in Auschwitz and the Nazi war machine, war and death and destruction have never left humanity. But never in the history of humanity has there been such an industrialized factory of death, a place dedicated only to wiping a nation off the face of the earth, so much so that when people spoke to people about it, to others about it, especially at the time, people wouldn't believe it. They couldn't believe the words, because gas chamber, it wasn't a phrase in a sense that had any meaning. The crematoria here were of a sense that was entirely different. And as we approach this fence, we move from the area of life to some extent inside Birkenau into the zone of death, a place which would have been separated off from the camp not only with barbed wire but with trees, because there was to some extent an attempt to keep secret what was going on here. Nevertheless, every single survivor pretty much that you can encounter will say that it took a matter of minutes, hours, or days that you could count on one hand before people understood where their family had gone, because all a prisoner needed to do was to point to the chimney that would have stuck out of the ruins of the building that you see in front of you, and to be able to say that is where your family are. That's what Leslie Kleiman recounts as a young boy of 14, being told, you want to see your mother, you want to see your family, they're over there. The chimney that sprouted out of this crematoria building, belching smoke and ash into the air, because you're standing at the place of the end, the destruction. One of 4 gas chamber crematoria complexes which exists on the Auschwitz Birkenau, the area of the Auschwitz Birkenau camp. And if we're going to walk past, we're going to come back to this building in a moment, we're going to walk to stand on the monument for a moment, looking out over what these remains are. These remains which, when you join later together with Deborah Lipstadt, and those of you who've watched the film made about her story, Denial, will be able to see how the study of these buildings connected to the trial that she was involved in order to fight against those people who look at what we're looking at and deny what its purpose was. Because all of those people that we left behind us on the ramp, and if I ask Lukács just to move to his right for a moment, just to look at the exactly, if you just go up the steps and then then slightly to the left, looking down over exactly. If we just approach the approach the edge of the steps so that we can see in, please, Lukasz. Because the vast expanse that you can see here underground, which would have been covered with a roof, is the undressing area, an area which could have contained close to 2,000 people. If you just pan to the right slightly, you'll see right at the far end over there are steps for people to come down, and all of those people that we left on the ramp, those people deemed not worthy of living, women and children, the elderly, anybody who seemed to be possibly a drain on resources, not a contribution towards the Nazi war machine, would have been brought here, down into the space here. You can stand where you are, Lukasz, and moving slightly to the left in this area to undress. And as the camera pans round, you see that like an L shape extends along the ground over there, also an underground chamber with a roof upon it, if the camera just stops right there. To what is just to the right of your screen, the ruins over there, was the gas chamber itself, only half the size pretty much of the undressing area, because when it came to the extermination, much less space was needed. And it is there that the extermination itself would happen. And then some of the most cursed victims of the Shoah were involved in the process of emptying out the gas chamber and bringing the bodies into the ruins that you see now on the left-hand side and disposing of them. Those prisoners, those Jewish prisoners known as the Sonderkommando, the special detachment, had to day after day process the bodies, dispose of the bodies of their fellow Jews. And the plight, as they saw community after community, often their own community, people that they knew coming through this vast factory of death. They saw there with their own eyes the destruction, and those who did survive give some of the most harrowing testimony of what it was that they saw there inside the gas chambers. And as we stand here and sort of come to the top of the story, the headline, so to speak, of Auschwitz Birkenau, it's incredibly difficult to stand at a place that takes the lives of in excess of 1 million Jews. You look at the destruction here, and you look at the fallen down walls, but you think for a moment about the vast communities, the vast number of communities that would have walked through here. And it wasn't the tumbling of bricks and mortar which is our tragedy today. It is looking at the tumbling, the destruction of so many lives, of communities, of everything which those people built, of everything those people should have become. And our challenge, in a sense, is to try and personalize it. And if you want to talk about one of the symbols of the Shoah, aside from Auschwitz, one of those symbols, in a sense, was created here, because in that undressing room over there, one of the things that people were asked to do was to remove their shoes, often to tie their laces together, lest they become separated. Part of the ruse that one day they're going to need their shoes again, but also because those shoes are going to ultimately be repurposed. They're going to be reused. And the shoe has become one of these symbols of the Holocaust, and I doubt there's any of us who cannot picture in our mind those piles of shoes belonging to the victims of the Shoah. Now, if I'm able to share the screen just for a moment, what you see here is just one of those shoes, discovered a few weeks ago amongst the pile of hundreds of thousands of shoes found in Auschwitz by some of the researchers there. And the problem I find that looking at the piles of shoes is it's unimaginable just how many people there were. But if you look carefully at this shoe, you look that it contains a name. It contains the name of Amos Steinberg. Amos Steinberg, a young boy who was born on the 26th of June 1938 in Prague, and just after his 4th birthday was taken to Theresienstadt, and come October 1944 was amongst 46,000 Jews from Theresienstadt deported to Auschwitz, together with his parents Ludwig and Ida. And as you look at the name inscribed in the shoe, I think there are very few among us who are parents who cannot remember writing our child's name inside their stuff, inside their property, inside their school bag, inside their shoes and their socks, to make sure that they don't get lost. And I think that as you look at the vastness of the destruction, you also need to be able to zoom in on just one boy, on a 4-year-old Amos Steinberg, one victim of the vast industry of death that you see here. And as we talk about his shoe and the shoes, there's something about shoes when it comes to this symbol of the Holocaust, because shoes tell you that you're going somewhere, especially a 4-year-old boy. With his shoes on, he can go anywhere. He can become anything. When you see the shoes in Auschwitz or any of these places, you see people's journeys who were brought to a halt. A journey by foot, a journey by train, a journey by truck. But you'll stand here at the end of the line, a place from where there are no more journeys. But today, for us, the shoes symbolize something else, because taking off your shoes is to be a mourner. To be someone who is in mourning is someone who takes off their shoes. Because you know what? When you're a mourner, you don't want to go anywhere. You don't want to leave. And in a sense, when we come here to Auschwitz Birkenau, as difficult as it is to be there, so too it is to leave. Because when we come here to a place like this, with Leslie Kleiman or any of the survivors that we're lucky enough to come with, JRoots were lucky enough to bring 105 survivors just in January for the anniversary of the liberation. When you come with survivors, on the one hand, they do not want to be there. But on the other hand, they don't want to leave. Because when you're a mourner, you don't want to leave the place where you last saw your loved one. And as we stand here, we have that same feeling. We come here in order to pay our respects. We come here in order to understand the plight of so many, to understand what it was to be a 4-year-old Amos Steinberg whose life ends in a place like this. And in a sense, we don't want to leave. But Tisha B'Av also tells us that towards the afternoon, we move onwards. We move upwards. We stop sitting on the floor and we start sitting on the chairs, because the story of the Jewish people cannot end like this and did not end like this. Although everything in the world, in a sense, was pointing towards an end to the Jewish people. Because who could possibly survive the vastness of the Nazi empire? Who could possibly survive a place which is a factory of death? But you know who it was? The Jewish people managed to survive. We managed some of those who were literally plucked from the embers, Leslie being one of them. And the response was not to fall into the abyss. The response was to start to rebuild, to say, what's next? In the same way that tonight we look out of Tisha B'Av and we say, what's next? What is the world asking of us? These are big questions at the moment. What is the Jewish people asking of us? But we ask ourselves those questions of what is next. Tisha B'Av, you know what? We're still in the depths of the destruction. And we come here, and I want to use the opportunity. I'm going to invite Rabbi Litwin to say one of the keynotes, one of the lamentations that we say on Tisha B'Av, dedicated specially to the tragedy that we're looking at. And sometimes on a normal year, we would sit in shul, in synagogue, on the floor and say it. But I think if we're here, so to speak, together, there is no better place to be able to recite that kinah, that lamentation of the destruction that we are looking at. So I'll hand over to Rabbi Litwin.
Thank you, Zach. It was just last year I actually stood right at this point together with you and together with Leslie, and we were there on a trip. We had a whole load of people there, and it's a trip, and people have asked me this, it's a trip that makes no sense. The trip makes no sense. People ask me, what are you thinking? What is Seed thinking, taking so many people to a place of such evil, of such destruction? What makes you think people will come away inspired? And I don't really understand the answer. I don't think anyone does. we just walk away uplifted, but perhaps we can try and understand a little. And I think the answer lies in this very place where we're looking at. It's a place where people spent their last few moments on this world. It's not a comfortable thing to think about, our last few moments on this world. But I know that many of these people ended their life with certain Hebrew words on their lips. The words of Shema Yisrael. Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. And that really brings us back to today. I heard a story this morning from Rabbi Yaakov Nadel in the name of Rabbi Aaron Lopiansky, and it's a story I can relate to personally, and you'll hear why. He says the story of a chassan, a groom, someone who was getting married. And Rabbi Lopiansky was invited to his wedding. And he says the wedding was beautiful. He was a handsome guy. Everyone was happy. You know, the families were respectable. The guests were dancing. He said, but a few years before, this chatan, this groom, his father had passed away. But no one could notice anything. He was dancing and things seemed happy. And he says, Rabbi Lopiansky says that there was a moment when he was able to take him into a room for a minute to have a quiet word. And the chatan broke down and he started to cry. Because even though things may have seemed perfect, inside his father was missing. What were those survivors? The survivors tell us a message. But those who gave up their lives perhaps spoke even louder with their last few words. They said, Shema Yisrael, listen people, Hashem Elokeinu. Seek Hashem in this world. Today is Tisha B'Av, and we're mourning so many things that the Jewish nation have been through. We're standing here at the place, the core of evil, which we'll speak about in a minute when we say the Kinot. But it all boils down to the Bet HaMikdash. It boils down to us missing Hashem. You know, our lives are relatively comfortable. It's been a difficult year, yeah. But so to speak, our lives are relatively comfortable. And it's hard for us to realize what we're missing. We need to hear the call of those people who gave up their lives. We need to hear the Shema Yisrael. We need to infuse our lives with more Hashem. More of Hashem. Small acts like that pearl Banish. You know, the lady was cutting off her hair, but she did it in a kind way. We have to think how we can bring Hashem into our life one teeny bit more. Shema Yisrael. And that, hopefully, will help us take some comfort from the ashes. And I'll now read the Kinot. This Kinot was written by the Rav of Bobov, the Bobov Rebbe of Shlomo Halberstam. It was written in 1984. And in his articulate Hebrew way, he describes what the Jewish people went through. Zechurna v'kainu kol Yisrael kolchem yishama be'ama ki yishmida Germania es hameinu b'mezam hamilchama b'misais meshunayis achzariyais b'rav u'batzama al tishkechu b'chal adorais adei tizkulu es banachama. The next part will discuss the screams and the weeping. You can see on this English side how they were tightly packed and locked in the cattle cars we've just seen. And remember their cries. ראשי ישיבות ותלמידיהם והמינם חשמה הבידום בעינוים קשים והרגום ביד רמה דמי ילדים רכים צעקים אליך מן האדמה לקיים נקמס טעם פרשים לישחיה כל נשמה. Remembering how this was, you know, no one was spared, the women, the children, the cries, the screams. Al sreif asal fei midrashais ubatei knisiyais For the voices of Crematoria and down the Kainain Bishiyais. Shulchu Boish Mikdashayay, Litisu Vainain Rutsofiais, Yeshalem Amavir Sabira, Yodim Bagayim Olekviais. Zaku Shamayim Vadamol, Alfaris, maybe it's Raytaya. Outside say we park in Israel, they Khalim Kamim Israel, Tzadikim Zkinim Bachasidim, they became not Torah. There's never been such a thing in the Jewish people. We've never had a tragedy of this magnitude, the amount of people. And we end by asking Hashem to take all this pain, to try and transform this pain into the rebirth of the third Beis Hamikdash and take us to Yerushalayim. Now, this event was sponsored for a refuah shalema of someone very special, Leslie. And I'm just before we mention that, I'm going to hand over back to Zak to share with you one more thought.
As Rabbi Litwin recites the Kinah for the Jews of Europe, for the victims of the Shoah, in a sense, we want to leave something there. We will be leaving this place. We'll be logging off. We can't visit. We can't come and pay our respects. I'm going to ask Lucas, who's been videoing and showing us the place, to light the candle on our behalf. A ner neshama, a candle for the soul, which he's going to place here at the ruins of the Crematoria, the ruins of the gas chamber, in memory of those who perished here. In particular, bearing in mind the family of Leslie Kleiman. And as the candle gets placed there, we understand that in Judaism, we use a candle to symbolize the soul, because we say, Ner Hashem Nishmat Adam. How does God illuminate the world? God illuminates the world with the soul of human beings. He doesn't need candles. He puts human beings there to illuminate the world. And the thing about a candle is that whatever you do with it, a candle, a flame will always reach upwards. And I think what we've seen in encountering some of those stories, some of those survivors, some of the different types of heroism that people displayed in a place like this, is that people strive. People strive to be human, to be good. And if we can take something from here, it's that ability. But one candle by itself is not quite enough. The beauty of a candle is the light that it shares. It can be shared infinitely without detracting from what it has. And so if the one candle that we light here today in memory of those souls can go on to light many more candles to illuminate the world, then maybe we start to be a part of the process of tikkun, of restoration and fixing that which is so broken, that which is broken in the world even today, and that which is broken in the world that Tisha B'Av talks about, because we live in a world which is in a sense destroyed. We live in a world which is full of crisis and hate and destruction. And Tisha B'Av alerts us to that. You see it in front of your very eyes at the moment. And maybe the things we move out of Tisha B'Av is to ask ourselves, what are we doing to be a part of the rebuilding, to be a part of bringing more light, more souls into the world, more life into the world, and hopefully that this candle should be a zecher, a memory for those souls which came before us, and also a torch, a light in order to direct us in terms of where we're going in the future, and hopefully that can be our message of Tisha B'Av.
Thank you, Zak. Yeah, very beautiful, and that's really the light. Also, it's resembling what we need to incorporate in our lives. We need to bring that into our life, and we're the lucky ones. We are still here. We carry the flame of all those people. We have to, find that Hashem. And this has been sponsored lovingly for the refuah shlema of a good friend of so many of us, Leslie Kleiman. I remember the first time I met Leslie, I think it was on Tisha B'Av about 5 years ago. I went to hear him speak. And you know, sometimes you connect with someone the whole way through the speech. I felt he was looking at me, and after the speech, you know, he came over, and since then, I've been lucky enough to have Leslie as, I would say, a friend in my life. And those who know Leslie will know he exudes love. He's someone who's been through the worst of horrors, but somehow he manages to transform that and turn that into a message of love, turn that into a message of giving, of more Hashem in this world. So if you'll join me, we'll say a Mishaberach for Leslie, that he should have a full recovery and be able to inspire many more people. Mishaberach Aviseinu Abraham Yitzchak Yaakov Moshe Aaron David Shlomo Hu Yivarech v'Yirapeh Sachoila Elazar ben Rachel Bar v'Shekol Ha'am Mispalim Ba'avuroi B'Zchaze HaKadosh Baruch Hu Yimal Yirachmim Olav La'achlimoi La'rapoisoi La'achzikoi La'achyoisoi V'yishlach Lo Me'erev V'Shlom Min HaShamayim B'Ramach Yivarech V'Shsag Gilov V'Seich She'achil Yisrael V'Fros HaNefesh V'Fros HaGuf Hashto Ba'Gala B'Zman Korev V'Neima Amen. And just before we finish, I want to say a thank you to everyone who enabled this to happen. Rabbi Edwards, Rabbi Birnbaum, JRoots, and our cameraman there we have on site. It's the only way we were able to give you the full-on experience. And we could finish with these two words, Shema Yisrael. It's Tisha B'Av. It's a day of mourning, but perhaps we can transform it into a day of yearning, a day of searching, a day of seeking Hashem in our lives. If we can take small steps, we mentioned Pearl Banish, whether it's Shabbat candles, any small steps in our life to bring Hashem into this world, we'll be dancing together very soon at the full redemption with Mashiach. Thank you.